In this episode, the creator revisits his earlier decision about which Hasselblad XCD lenses to keep and which to sell, offering a candid update and a thoughtful exploration of the concept often called lens compression. In his previous video, he had tested 8 older XCD lenses on the Hasselblad XCD Mark II, evaluating autofocus performance, mounting stability, and overall handling. At that time, he decided to keep only the XCD 120mm macro lens because it performed well for manual focus work, especially in tethered shooting. However, after further reflection and real-world experience, he changed his mind. He decided that the XCD 135mm lens, along with its dedicated converter, deserved a permanent spot in his kit. His reason for keeping it wasn't just about sharpness or autofocus, it was about the visual poetry of distance, perspective, and the perception of compression in landscape photography. He explains that out of the 8 older XCD lenses, 6 are still on their way out, but the 135mm has earned its place. This decision came after a client shoot where he was working on a large format panorama that required every bit of resolution possible, reaching into the 400 to 500 megapixel range through stitching and upscaling. Using the 35 to 100mm zoom at 100mm, he found himself struggling with a composition problem and unattractive rooftop at the bottom of his frame. Keeping the camera level meant that cropping out the distraction would have cost him valuable megapixels. To maintain resolution and avoid cropping, he needed a longer focal length. That moment reignited his curiosity about the 135mm lens, and the results surprised him. The images captured with the XCD 135mm were stunning, beautifully layered, with the foreground cityscape, Lake Zurich, and the Swiss Alps behind appearing to press closer together in a way that created depth and drama. This is where the idea of compressed landscape comes into play. Many photographers use the term to describe how telephoto lenses make distant objects appear closer together, but he argues that this is actually a myth. What people often call lens compression isn't caused by the lens bending space or altering perspective, it's caused by the change in vantage point. The longer focal length simply forces the photographer to move farther away to fit the same scene into the frame, and that change in distance is what alters how foreground and background elements relate to each other. To illustrate this, he describes a simple thought experiment. Imagine standing 10 meters away from a tree, with another tree 90 meters farther behind it. The far tree appears much smaller, perhaps 1/10 the size of the near one. If you then move your position 90 meters backward, you're now 100 meters away from the near tree and 190 meters from the far tree. Suddenly, the far tree no longer looks tiny, it appears about half the size of the near one. Nothing magical has happened, the geometry of distance has simply changed. By increasing the camera to subject distance, the relative size difference between near and far objects has decreased, making them look closer together. The lens merely dictates how much of that scene fits into the frame. A wide-angle lens shows a broad field of view, so you need to stand closer to fill the frame. A telephoto lens narrows the field of view, forcing you to stand back. As you back up, distance is flattened, and the perspective feels compressed. This, he says, is why the idea of lens compression is technically incorrect, even though it's a useful shorthand. A lens doesn't physically compress space, it's our distance from the subject that changes how we perceive the spatial relationships. Still, he admits that compressed landscape is a beautiful term because it describes a real, emotional perception that many photographers love. It's the look of the mountains appearing larger and more majestic behind a city, or the way distant hills seem to stack up behind a valley. Comparing two example photos, one shot with an iPhone at 24mm and one with the Hasselblad at 100mm, he shows how dramatically different the scenes feel. In the wide-angle image, the foreground buildings dominate, and the mountains on the horizon shrink into a faint line. In the telephoto image, the city looks more balanced, the lake expands visually, and the mountains stand tall and impressive. It's the same location, but the change in distance and focal length transforms the mood completely. The telephoto shot feels more cinematic, more intimate, and more emotionally powerful, while the wide-angle version feels detached and cluttered with unwanted foreground elements. After experimenting with the XCD 135mm lens, he realized that its ability to render this compressed perception was exactly what his project needed. The autofocus may not match the speed or sophistication of newer XCD lenses, especially when using face detection. But for landscape and cityscape work where focus is often set manually or single-shot, it performs beautifully. He acknowledges that a firmware update could further improve these older lenses, but even as they are, their optical quality is flawless. The real limitation is in modern autofocus behavior, not image quality. He then turns to the results of his client shoot. Working in Lightroom, he reviews the stitched panorama captured with the XCD 135mm on the XCD Mark II. The final image measures over 441 megapixels after stitching and scaling, allowing it to be printed in enormous sizes without losing detail. The scene shows Zurich City in the evening, with fog softly hanging over Lake Zurich and the Alps glowing faintly in the background. From his elevated vantage point, every layer of the scene from city lights to distant mountains is rendered in exquisite clarity. Cropping in at 100% reveals individual cars, readable signs, tiny windows, and even graffiti on distant walls. This level of resolution and realism gives the image a tactile sense of presence, making it ideal for large-format prints where viewers can step close and still discover details. He emphasizes how much satisfaction it brings to explore such an image at full resolution. The lens captures minute details without softness, proving how capable the XCD 135mm remains even in the era of faster, quieter autofocus lenses. It's not just about sharpness, it's about the feeling of depth, the atmosphere of distance collapsing beautifully into a unified frame. From the fog over the lake to the glowing church tower in the city, every part of the composition sings together in harmony. For him, this was a moment of rediscovery. He realized that selling the 135mm lens would have been a mistake. It filled a crucial role in his toolkit that neither the 100mm zoom nor the 120mm macro could replace. The Hasselblad system, he points out, currently doesn't offer many telephoto options beyond 135mm. That makes the lens even more valuable for photographers who work with landscapes, architecture, or distant cityscapes. It bridges the gap between the moderate telephoto range and true long lens territory, giving medium-format shooters a way to explore the beauty of distant compression without sacrificing image quality. In closing, he thanks his viewers for their support and shares a note for those interested in picking up some of his other XCD lenses, which he plans to sell at roughly 70% of their current market value through a trusted colleague in Zurich. But the XCD 135mm will not be part of that sale. It has earned its place in his camera bag through experience and results. His advice to other Hasselblad users is simple. If you already own the XCD 135mm, don't let it go. It may not be the fastest focusing lens in the lineup, but when it comes to rendering detail, perspective, and that elusive perception of compressed landscapes, it is truly extraordinary. The video concludes with a reflection on how understanding perspective changes the way photographers think about focal length. The beauty of telephoto landscapes lies not in the lens itself, but in the relationship between distance, geometry, and perception. By stepping back, the world folds together, mountains draw closer to cities, layers of atmosphere intertwine, and what was once distant becomes part of the same visual story. It's not the lens that compresses space, it's the photographer's choice of where to stand. And in that simple act of stepping back, art is born.